Hello and welcome to Breaking Down, the series where we analyse a Fire Emblem unit from a gameplay perspective. Today we will be taking a look at the leader of the Blue Lions and heir to the throne of Faerghus, Dimitri. Whilst this series is not focused around plot, there is always a chance for spoilers, and certain elements of the game and its structure and story will inevitably be mentioned. So if that is a concern for you, feel free to give it a miss. Also, where relevant, this is considering the maddening difficulty on a regular new game file with no exploits or excessive grinding. Dimitri is the house leader of the Blue Lions, and as a result is only available if you choose them as your house. He cannot be recruited, so if you do want to make use of him, Azure Moon will have to be your route. Dimitri does have some slight quirks regarding his availability. Being a house leader, he is a mandatory deployment on most chapters, and like his Golden Deer and Black Eagles counterparts, he is unavailable for the Chapter 6 mission. Where Dimitri does differ from them is at the start of Part 2, where for plot reasons he is unable to be tutored until Chapter 18. This can have an impact on his development, but that's something we will get into more later. The only other thing that is worth bearing in mind is that Dimitri is available for the prologue, which does give him a small extra opportunity to gain some experience over most of your other units. Dimitri's personal ability is Royal Lineage. This is extremely straightforward. It increases Dimitri's XP gain by 20%. It's hard to find anything to complain about here really. It's a very useful bit of kit that allows him to fast track his way to class masteries and potentially get an extra chapter to master those classes over his comrades, as well as obviously having small statistical advantages just from being a higher level. In Part 2, this upgrades to Royal Lineage Plus. This keeps the original effect as well as granting an additional one, which gives Dimitri an additional 20 of Void when at full HP. This is mostly fine, there are no real downsides to it. That being said, it isn't all too useful either. It's not something you're ever going to complain about, but it isn't anything earth-shattering for him, and the 1.2 times extra XP is still more useful. Dimitri's Crest is a minor crest of Bladed, which gives a 10% chance to double the might of an attack as well as double weapon uses when using a combat art. Overall, I'm not a massive fan of this one. It's too inconsistent to be relied upon, and whilst doubling weapon uses on a standard weapon like an Iron Lance isn't a big deal, on a relic or something more difficult to repair, or something that you were planning to use on the enemy phase, it can actually be problematic. Its unreliability also means it can be difficult when trying to feed XP to other units, since Dimitri can randomly decide to just kill them. That's not to say there will never be situations where it's a positive, but I would say more often than not, it is a bit of a nuisance. One advantage of the Crest is that with the relic weapon Ariad Bar, Dimitri can use its combat art Atrocity, which grants a massive boost of 15 might and 20 hit, as well as providing effective damage against all enemies. Long story short, if you click this on something, it's probably dead. The only downside of it is the cost of 4 durability on a difficult to repair weapon with only 20 uses. Here is a prime example of where the Crest's actual effect would be extremely unappreciated. The enemy would die anyway, and you've just reduced the amount of times you can use the ability. As far as Dimitri's skill spread goes, he has a boon in Swords, Lances, and Authority, Banes in Axes and Reason, and a budding talent in Riding. Let's get the negative out of the way first. The Axe Bane is pretty bad. There are a lot of desirable classes which are reliant on axes as a part of their certification, and this just adds an extra barrier in the way of reaching them. It's worth noting that this doesn't make these classes impossible or even particularly difficult for Dimitri to reach in a lot of cases, but requiring extra investment is never a good thing, since it takes up tutoring sessions and resources that you would rather put elsewhere, either in Dimitri's other skills or into other units. One area where this can actually cause issues is with the master classes, most notably Wyvern Lord and War Master, which both require an A axe rank. Due to Dimitri's inability to be tutored early in Part 2, this can cause even further problems. This can catch unaware players off guard and make these very difficult to reach if you are not investing in advance for them, and even if you are, it's extremely resource intensive. With that aside though, Dimitri's skills and the things granted to him by them are very, very good. First up is his Lances, with a base of D+, giving him access to Tempest Lance from the get-go, a very powerful early combat art which grants a very appreciated boost of 8 might, as well as 10 hit, allowing for some incredible damage output right from the off. The boon here is helpful too. Being able to quickly reach skills like Swordbreaker or Lance Crit plus 10 can be very impactful at various points of the game, and it also gives him easier qualification into some strong classes, such as Paladin or Bow Knight. Speaking of qualification skills, let's quickly touch on that budding talent in Riding. With a base D rank in the skill, Dimitri has the requirement in this area to qualify for Cavalier at level 10. Whilst not a super desirable class, it is a 6-move option at the early stages of the game, which will always have its uses, especially on maps that are less punishing to mounts, so access to it is always going to be something which can be taken advantage of, especially on males since they cannot access Pegasus Knight. Mastering the budding talent by tutoring Dimitri in riding 12 times gives Seal movement, the most underwhelming skill in the game. Enemies hit by this lose 1 movement until the start of the next turn. This is obviously still a positive thing, but it is very low impact, especially when compared to the other Seal skills, such as Seal Defense or Seal Speed, which reduce the relevant stat by 6, or other movement restricting tools like Banshee, Encloser, or Gambits, which either have much larger restrictions or freeze the opponent entirely. And for something which is completely unique to Dimitri, you'd expect Seal movement to pack a bit more power. Dimitri's swords aren't a star area of his kit, but they do actually bring some nice tools with them, most notably Windsweep at the A rank. This is a combat art which ends the combat after it hits, effectively preventing enemy counterattacks, which can be very useful for whittling away at tankier enemies, especially some of the later game bosses. He can potentially also raise this to D+ to be able to gamble qualification into Thief at level 10, which can sometimes provide some small advantages. Whilst there are a lot of positives in here already, we are yet to talk about Dimitri's best skill, and that is his authority. This is primarily fueled by a unique skill combination which no other unit gets access to. These skills are Battalion Wrath acquired at the C rank and Battalion Vantage obtained at the A rank. Whilst other units get these skills individually, Dimitri alone gets them together. Battalion Wrath gives a boost of 50 crit to the user on the enemy phase when their battalion endurance is below 33%. Battalion Vantage has the same condition, but instead allows the user to attack first on the enemy phase. This means that with just a low endurance battalion, something which can be prepared in advance, carries over between maps, and provides no immediate drawbacks, Dimitri massively inflates his crit rate, and can kill enemies before they have a chance to hit him. This basically gives Dimitri the best enemy phasing in the game for just an A authority rank, and I will break down why this method is so much better than the other enemy phasing methods later in the video, but for now it's worth pointing out that this area has other benefits too. Earlier and easier access to stronger battalions is always a huge plus, since they can be used to reinforce his already solid stats. Speaking of Dimitri's stats, let's take a look at those next. The standout here is his strength, which is only behind Edelgard and Byleth at level 1, tied with his vassal Dedu. Charm is another very strong area, with a base of 9 being second only to his Black Eagle's counterpart. His HP and defense stats are also very comfortable, giving him a fair amount of early bulk. He is slightly on the slower side of things with just 7 base speed, but this isn't too unmanageable, and his high base strength means he may be offsetting more weapon weight than some others who find themselves struggling with this value, such as Lorenz or Bernadetta. Growths in general are another area where Dimitri really excels. 60% in strength is the highest in the game, and with 55% in charm and HP, 50% in speed, and 40% in defense, he will grow pretty well in the most important areas, with a 50% dex growth also being very nice. It's worth bearing in mind that given you distribute EXP properly, he will also grow a level in the prologue, as well as having 20% extra EXP from Royal Lineage, so may hold a slight level advantage over your other units in the very early game. The last thing to note here is that Dimitri possesses 2 might supports. Like all house leaders, he has one with Byleth and one with his retainer, who in this case is Dedu. These can both reach the A rank and in general can be pretty useful as damage supplementation. From here, let's look at Dimitri's actual pathing within the game and how to use him on the field. Dimitri's first investment should be to pick up Curved Shot, which can be gotten from D bows. This is a combat art which provides an additional 30 hit, 1 might, and has a range of 2 to 3. Since he is neutral in this area, it should be easily doable before Chapter 2, which gives Dimitri the combination of Tempest Lance and Curved Shot early on, allowing for a lot of flexibility, reliability, and damage, depending on which you choose to use. Right from the start, Dimitri will want to be keeping a steady focus on his authority. As far as power spikes go, Dimitri's A rank authority is one of the most profound in the game, unlocking the incredibly potent combination of Battalion Wrath and Battalion Vantage. This obviously has other benefits too, allowing him to use any battalions that he may want to. You will of course want to invest in other areas too, but don't lose sight of the long-term goal along the way. At level 5, Fighter is Dimitri's best choice. The extra damage the class provides is nice, and Strength +2 can be useful if the class is mastered. The bow ranks gained for picking up Curved Shot will be enough to guarantee qualification here, so this isn't an issue either. When looking at Dimitri's intermediate classes, he has a few options. One of these is Archer, which can be qualified for at C bows or gambled a little lower. Alongside being a strong class at this point in time anyway, its mastery grants hit plus 20, which increases the hit of all attacks by 20. This includes gambits. The benefits of this are obvious. It makes him a lot more reliable throughout the game, and as mentioned, the Archer class is a strong one anyway, so there's no downside to using it at the time. Cavalier is another valid option here once you have hit plus 20. It doesn't grant anything too desirable when mastered, since Desperation doesn't really suit Dimitri. It is a pretty strong class for him to actually be in, since it has 6 move and access to Canto. On maps where the terrain is relatively kind to your mounted units, it can be a strong class to deploy to grant Dimitri more mobility. Brigand, when mastered, grants Deathblow, an ability which grants 6 attack when the user initiates combat. This is an incredibly beneficial ability, especially because Dimitri's player phase kill power is basically walking a tightrope for a large portion of the game. Whilst he doesn't get any major combat arts in this area to help him out, his high growths and ability to use strong battalions thanks to his Orth boon can compensate for this somewhat. A plus 6 attack boost here definitely does help him in this regard. Now there are some slight drawbacks to this. First of all, Dimitri's Axebane can increase the amount of investment required to qualify for the class. Secondly, Brigand just really isn't that great to actually be in, especially compared to the other options available, Archer and Cavalier. Deathblow is also debatably a skill you may not stick with here in the long term, as there are other options which may be more desirable. Because of this, you may want to wait until getting the Knowledge Gem from the Sothis Paralog in Chapter 8 to pick this skill up, since it will then only take 25 combats instead of 50, assuming you have the class mastery buff from the Saint Sethlin statue, as well as giving you longer to grab the axe rank. On the other hand, getting this one out of the way earlier means Dimitri can be in the stronger classes when he hits his power spike, and the Blue Lions early game should be more than enough to compensate for a slightly handicapped Dimitri, since a lot of their units excel at this point in time. The third option is to just skip it altogether. There are other strong options here, and whilst it will leave Dimitri slightly weaker on his player phase damage in the short term, it lets him stick to better classes. In the long run, there are a lot of skill options here that, as mentioned, you may end up dropping Deathblow anyway. I don't think any of these options are outright correct. It largely depends on your team setup, how much investment you are willing to pump into Dimitri, and the build you plan to go with him later in the game. Deathblow does have its merits, but its drawbacks too, and picking it up is fairly optional in this case. I do want to quickly touch on Thief as a potential class qualification here, as it has 11 base speed. Dimitri on average has 11.5 speed at level 10, so it usually won't be necessary, but if he is rolling slightly lower than average, you can bump his swords up to a D+ rank and class into Thief for a small boost, which with the boon is very easy to do. This is about all there is to consider with Dimitri's intermediate classes, and it's about time we go into Dimitri's primary tools, Battalion Wrath and Battalion Vantage. You should be looking to pick these up for around Chapter 8, and again you want to keep consistent investment into Dimitri's authority until he has access to them. Just as a reminder, this combination gives Dimitri 50 crit and the ability to attack first on the enemy phase when his battalion is below 33% endurance. You are going to want to make sure that this conditional is set up on a battalion Dimitri can make good use of, ideally one that bolsters his hit and crit. The most optimal ones will probably not be available for this yet, but we can touch on that later. When doing this, you are going to want to keep padding Dimitri's crit as high as it can go by using killer weapons, relevant crit boosting skills, battalions, and equipment if the slot is free. You will also want to do the same to hit, with things like hit plus 20, relevant weapon prowess skills, and once again equipment and battalions. The Gambit Retribution being used by another unit onto Dimitri is incredibly strong here. This gives him the counter ability for 5 turns, allowing him to retaliate against attacks from any range. Not only does this give him more kill power, but it also means he does not have to take attacks from ranged foes, since they will be dead before they get the chance due to Vantage. Whilst this is always a useful tool, this is especially prominent here, due to the frequency of which enemy siege attacks are seen in the Azure Moon route. I'm going to take this opportunity to outline why this combination of Battalion Wrath and Battalion Vantage is so strong, because whilst it is unique to Dimitri, it is at the end of the day just another way to enemy phase, something that a lot of units are capable of, so what exactly makes this way of doing it so special? Let's start by comparing it with Wrath Vantage. the non-battalion variant of this, as it's the easiest to compare. For those who are unaware, this is the same set of skills, however instead of the requirement being based around battalion endurance, it is instead based upon the unit's HP being below 50%. Vantage is acquired from mastering the intermediate class Mercenary, and Wrath from mastering the advanced class Warrior. The battalion variant has 3 key advantages over this. The first of these are incredibly obvious. Its unlock method is both available earlier and much easier. Raising authority to the A rank is much easier to do than mastering 2 fairly underwhelming classes in Mercenary and Warrior, and can also be done much earlier as there is not the level 20 roadblock to accessing Warrior. The second is that Bat Wrath and Bat Vantage are active right from the get-go and do not need to be set up in the map itself. Battalion Endurance is carried over between missions, and therefore you do not need to think about how you will activate Wrath Vantage. Whilst you can activate Wrath Vantage on turn 1 and therefore have it active for the first enemy phase, this can still inhibit optimal positioning and force you to spend that first player phase attacking an enemy who will get you to that threshold which may not be desirable. The third is that the battalion variant is significantly safer should something go wrong. In the event of Dimitri having to take an attack, either through a miss by him, an attack which doesn't kill his enemy, an attack which he cannot counter due to no retribution, a gambit, or other circumstances, he will still be at full health and can likely tank it with no troubles. Due to the half health requirement of the regular variant, these scenarios can be incredibly threatening to them and pose a lot more danger. We can also look at comparing it to dodge tanking, the process of raising a unit's avoid so that they dodge any attack thrown at them. This is usually coupled with Battalion Wrath, to allow them to strike back with a critical hit of their own after the dodge, killing their attacker. Once again, Dimitri's method comes online a lot earlier. Dodge tanking usually relies on Alert Stance Plus, which is obtained at A+ flying. Not only is this a higher rank in the appropriate skill than the A authority Dimitri needs, but it is also potentially slower to raise. Every attack where Dimitri has a battalion equipped will grant him authority EXP, which can be from chapter 2 onwards, whereas to gain flying XP in battle, you need to be in a flying class. Female units can do this from level 10, so around chapter 5 or 6, whereas males need to wait until level 20, so around chapter 9 or 10. It is worth noting that the group activity that raises flying can somewhat compensate for this, but Bat Vantage and Bat Wrath will still be online earlier. Also, bear in mind that dodge tanks will still need to raise authority anyway, both to unlock Battalion Wrath for themselves and to be able to make use of strong battalions. On top of this, dodge tanks have 3 stats that they need to inflate as high as possible: hit, crit, and avoid, whereas Dimitri just requires the former 2, meaning that a lot less needs to be put into him, and resources that raise avoid, such as battalions or an evasion ring, can be given to other units who would benefit from them. It's also just easier to manage 2 stats going up rather than 3, and being easier for the player to manage and leaving less room for error is a good thing. However, the biggest advantage that Dimitri has here is the player phase. Alert Stance Plus, used by dodge tanks, only works if the user ends their turn with the wait command, meaning they cannot attack on the player phase. Dimitri has no such restriction and is free to make use of both phases, using the player phase to wipe out anything that may pose a threat, most notably killing gambit users or destroying the barriers of monsters. Another method of enemy phasing is protection tanking with Battalion Wrath. This is similar to dodge tanking, except instead of dodging the initial attack, you just eat the hit, ideally taking 0 damage from it. This is less popular than the other methods, but one that I personally am quite fond of, especially on certain units like Raphael or Gilbert. The biggest issue here is that mages can actually pose a huge threat to your protection tanks, since they are usually focused on the physical side of things. Not only can this put the unit themselves in a dangerous situation, but it can also cause significant harm to their battalion, and risk eliminating its endurance entirely, at which point Battalion Wrath deactivates. Obviously, this is something you can position and play around, but not having to do so and just being able to kill the mages on the enemy phase is a huge advantage, especially when you consider siege tomes. Once again, prot tanks also have to manage 3 stats: protection, hit, and crit, whereas Dimitri only needs to manage the same 2 as before. Raising protection may also sometimes involve making use of worse overall classes, such as Fortress Knight or Great Knight, to be able to adequately tank the opposition, whereas Dimitri is completely class independent. This covers the other main methods of enemy phasing, and hopefully outlines why Dimitri's skill combination is the best. It basically makes up for most of the weaknesses of all the other methods, and is just such a ridiculously strong combination of abilities, especially being available as early as Chapter 8. There are other aspects of Dimitri himself that really help out here too. His stellar charm stat makes avoiding enemy gambits pretty likely for him to do, which as one of the main threats of enemy phase units, having that reduced is a huge benefit for him. This also helps in the other direction too, as he stands a high, if not guaranteed, chance of landing gambits that he goes for. Since rattled enemies are unable to use gambits of their own, this can be hugely beneficial in the event you are unable to secure a kill on one of them, or for locking down potentially multiple at once. So, enough about why these abilities are so good, what about endgame classes? Well, honestly, you can kind of just take your pick. Dimitri can thrive in just about anything. Personally, I would say the two things to value highest are movement for enemy phase positioning, and player phase killing power. One thing to bear in mind is that the Azure Moon route is relatively kind to your cavalry. Considering the Bane in axes and Dimitri's tutoring unavailability in early Part 2 can make it a very high investment process to reach the A rank for Wyvern Lord, this is a huge blessing, as it significantly reduces the impact this has if you choose not to go for it. Personally, whilst flight is still appreciated, I don't think Wyvern Lord is worth the investment here. On top of this, the lack of access to grounded battalions is a fairly significant drawback. With all of that in mind, whilst it is tempting, I don't think Wyvern is the best option here. There is a benefit to it, but I struggle to justify the costs for them, and feel that the differences in mobility between them and the 8-move mounted classes is relatively minimal in Azure Moon. Speaking of mounts, one great option for Dimitri is Paladin. This brings with it several very strong upsides. Firstly, thanks to the boon in Lancers and the budding talent in Riding, it is very easy to reach the Bs in both of these to guarantee certification, massively reducing the investment needed for Dimitri's endgame. It also puts him in his final class at level 20, which will be reached around chapter 9 or 10, meaning the lack of tutoring in part 2 has a lot less impact. Being a lance-based class, it also benefits Dimitri's strong existing lance skills, including his relic weapon, Ariad Bar, since it comes with innate lance fare. This amplifies the damage he can do quite notably, and whilst this isn't necessary on the enemy phase, on the player phase you really need all the damage you can get. The small +2 damage modifier the class provides is also valuable for this. As an overall though, Dimitri's player phase kill potential here is relatively poor. Since he is going to want to use the killer lance on the enemy phase, it locks him out of the more powerful weaponry to pick off the more threatening targets, unless you can trade swap him back. It also means that he cannot take advantage of the massive power of Atrocity too often, which will mainly be reserved for bosses or monsters. Since he lacks any of the primary player phase tools built innately into his kit, things like Swift Strikes or Vengeance, it leaves a fair amount of things that may need outside assistance to take care of. I'm going to start specifying this more often because I feel it has sometimes been misunderstood. When I talk about kill power, I'm talking about being able to kill any threats that need to be dispatched. He can still deal with the squishier targets with a simple combat art hit. For example, if we're looking at the early part 2 chapters, he can still wipe out the random archers with gambits that decide to linger around at this point in time with no issues at all, but against things like paladins or great knights, he may need a hand. Armoured units also present themselves as a rare problem here, as his need to use the killer lance on the enemy phase stops him from being able to easily abuse anti-armour weaponry. There are options here though. The first is obviously to use the other members of your team. Strong player phase units who are able to wipe out gambit users and canto out of the range of the targets who need to focus Dimitri, siege mages such as Constance or Dorothea to pick off weaker battalion wielders or soften up tougher ones for Dimitri to kill, rally strength to boost Dimitri's own kill power, etc. Make sure to use any movement tools at your disposal such as Stride, Rescue and Warp to make this process easier. As mentioned earlier, enemies that are rattled cannot use their gambits, so even your party members who are unable to kill can help out in this way by rattling opponents. Now, I'm not completely sure this is a strategy I should be recommending, but as it's one I use, I'm going to anyway. Because even without Battalion Wrath, Dimitri still has a very reasonable crit rate, it can be perfectly valid to just see if you crit something you can't kill without, and pulse if not, especially later in the game when the amount of these you get really racks up. I'm not going to get into burning RNG at too deep of a level here, but if you don't crit, try attacking with another one of your party members, and then try the Dimitri hit again if you still feel you have pulses to spare. If you feel like you are going to try this, make sure you bring the Monster Breaker combat art with you, as this provides an additional 10 crit. At the end of the day, you know how many Divine Pulses you feel comfortable having in the locker, and whether or not you feel comfortable risking throwing them away like this. More confident and experienced players will be safer doing this than players who are less familiar with the game, especially on Maddening, and that's absolutely fine. Don't feel any necessity to risk throwing away a map just because it may make the odd kill a bit easier. Knowing your own limits and what resources you personally can afford to spend is a skill in and of itself, and is entirely dependent on the player. I will say, regardless of how confident you are, don't burn too many pulses in this way if you don't know where and when the ambush spawns come in, because there is every chance it will come back to bite you. If it isn't obvious already, Paladin is my preferred class for Dimitri. I think the drawbacks of his player phase can be navigated without too much trouble, and even if not, his high charm reduces the chance of enemy gambits landing anyway. If you feel you do want more power on the player phase though, one class which I don't think gets enough recognition for him is Sniper. First, the negatives. Sniper requires A bows to guarantee certification into, which is an area where Dimitri does not have a boon. This means you have to prepare in advance for this qualification, however it is still very attainable without too much trouble in Part 1, being another advanced class and therefore available at level 20. The bigger issue by far is the 5 move, which heavily limits where you can position Dimitri to get strong enemy phases out of him. It also doesn't come with Canto, so after attacking or taking an action on the player phase, you can't reposition. Both of these are quite impactful, and really hurt Dimitri's enemy phase performance, so what are the reasons to consider this class? Well, the main one by far is Hunter's Volley, the combat art you acquire from mastering the class. This guarantees 2 attacks in succession, making kills on the player phase incredibly consistent. This basically solves a lot of the problems outlined earlier with Paladin, however it is worth noting that the movement penalty is quite severe. Sniper does get a lot of range on its player phase attacks, especially with the increase provided by Hunter's Volley, which can help compensate for the reduced movement somewhat. There are a few other class considerations I see thrown out. Swordmaster is just worse than the other options available. Bow Knight is extremely similar to Paladin, but with way higher investment for very little gain, and the amount of siege tomes in the route means you will likely still be using Retribution even with its huge range. Warmaster doesn't bring too many advantages and has insane investment, and Dimitri's own personal classes, High Lord and Great Lord, just don't bring that much to the table, and only have 6 move with no Canto. I think Paladin is the way to go here, as it really maximizes Dimitri's enemy phase whilst also being very low cost. As far as what Dimitri actually wants in terms of a build, you do have some options, as was mentioned earlier with Deathblow. Personally, I tend to go for Lance Prowess, Lance Crit, Hit plus 20, Battalion Wrath, and Battalion Vantage, but if you do value higher damage output, particularly on the player phase, you can try swapping in Deathblow and Lancefare, the latter of which Dimitri is able to reach in a reasonable time frame just due to the sheer amount of lance combat he can see from such an early point in the game. Either an accuracy or a crit ring can be helpful too, depending on what Dimitri needs more, and giving him a good battalion is very important. I personally think the best choice is usually the Index Sword Fighters, which provides 10 crit and 20 hit at max rank. The Keyhole Wyvern Co or Goneril Valkyries would actually be better, but as flying battalions are quite limited, you probably want to save these for your flying units, as the Sword Fighters should be more than enough for Dimitri. Since they are an A authority requirement, this also doesn't contest your other units who haven't raised authority and may need the lower rank options, such as the King of Lion Corps. It makes full use of Dimitri's investment into the skill. This battalion is gotten from Oil and Water, the Hanneman and Manuela paralogue, so make sure to complete that to pick this up. The last thing to mention is to make sure you keep Dimitri fueled up with a couple of killer lancers per map. He will burn through them very quickly, especially if you use them on the player phase too, and you don't want to be stuck with a broken one in the middle of a horde of enemies, so sending him in with 2 or even 3 is ideal. Make sure you keep your Black Sandsteel supplies up to repair these two, particularly on days where you do paralogue battles, as you may need to repair between maps, and you can only buy Black Sandsteel when exploring, not from the marketplace screen in the prep menu. One thing to bear in mind is that when you enter Part 2, Dimitri is given a fully repaired battalion in Chapter 13, which you cannot unequip until the mission is complete. This means Battalion Wrath and Battalion Vantage will be deactivated for this mission unless you are able to chip the new battalion low enough, but considering its massive 120 endurance, this isn't very likely. He will also be forced into the High Lord class. Kitting Dimitri out in Chapter 12 to prepare for this is recommended, with Swordbreaker being a particularly useful skill here. Just make sure to change him back again when you are done. This has been an incredibly long one, so I'm going to wrap this up here. Overall, in terms of just a raw combat unit, Dimitri is probably the best in 3 houses, with Batwrath and Bat Vantage coming online very early and being a very easy way to dispatch huge volumes of enemies on basically every map, with very little threatening him. His own personal stats help him out here a lot too, with high strength letting him secure kills, and charm to avoid and land gambits. I hope this helps you get the most out of Dimitri. If you want to discuss this series, get updates on the channel, or talk about Fire Emblem in general, feel free to hop in the Discord, a link to which is in the description below. Thank you for watching.